Thanks very much, thanks very much, Timmy and Lynn, for letting me in ahead of you. And I'm under pressure here to do a family thing as well as go down for leaders. But yeah, it's a very interesting discussion and a very important discussion, as was said by others. And I want to thank all the presenters for giving us their insights into this issue. The first thing I'd like to ask, and I suppose it's been asked in other ways, but I'd like to ask it quite directly to the IFA and the INHF, is to the extent to which they accept that there is a problem, that we have a biodiversity crisis. And do you, for example, accept the Environmental Protection Agency report on water quality, or how SWAN have defined it here? It's just a direct question. I don't want to get into the argument about the science, but if you actually accept that we have a crisis here on our hands, and then I just want to say I have a small bit of sympathy for the presentation from the Natura and Hill Farmers Association, insofar as that they see the law as being targeted at one of the sort of best behaved, if you like, population of farmers, those on the hillside in the west, whereas it's been identified, and particularly by SWAN, that the real problem with nitrates and nitrogen and pollution of our waters is coming from the south and the southeast. And that would imply that the real problem stems from the big dairy industry rather than the hillside farmers, and that the emphasis of the legislation is on the hillside farmers rather than on the damage done by the industry. And it suggests a certain preoccupation of the law with those who live in the areas that are least offensive, the peatland areas and the hills, etc. And while I accept they do need to be re-wetted and it's hugely important, there is an imbalance in the way the legislation is looking at them, rather than the biggest polluters from animals and fertilisers and slurry. And if you could all comment on that, please. And the last question I have is on Coillte and the Gresham House deal. I mean, I think what we saw a big backlash from the public and from many of the campaigns about this deal. And I think the government themselves have said, oh, well, we better not push this too far, because I think it's recognised that what we're doing here is we're allowing a company who wants to buy themselves carbon offsets to further pollute the land. And Coillte being the biggest landholder in the state, it's pretty disgraceful that they have gone for this, or that the government and Coillte have gone for this kind of a response. So would you comment on that? And also, would you tell me if you're opposed to that deal or not, from all of the organisations here, and particularly those who have given us the SWAN and the environmental pillar, who've given us the clearest outline of what needs to be done for the environment. So they're my three questions. Thanks very much, as I say, for letting me in.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. So the farming organisations first.
Maybe if I just start off, thank you, Deputy Smith. The IFA are not climate deniers. We've never ever said that we're not prepared to do anything or encourage our members to go in a certain direction. But clearly, this is multifaceted. This approach has to also include that rural economies and farmers still have to have a level of viability going forward. So I just want to clearly state that. If any farmer wishes to go and re-wet their farm, reinstate their land, that is entirely up to them, and I will defend their interests and their ability to do that if they so wish. But they have to go in with the clear knowledge of what they are doing and what is expected of them. So that's the first thing. But as I've said before, this has to come with an ability for them still to be able to have a respectable living going forward. If it's been requested of them that they reduce their farming activity, and I'm not sure still, after listening to all of the debates, on how much farming activity will still be allowed on these types of soils or on these farms. So what is the economic sustainability of that farm going forward.
So just to interrupt there, we did hear clear evidence that farming can continue for the most part on a lot of these re-wetted lands. That's the scientific evidence that we've received.
Well,
so
I do think, Chairman, that we would like to see that, while it's been spoken, to bring that down to a farm level and see how farming can continue if a proportion of a farmer's land is being...
yeah, so there's a narrative out there that re-wetting land equates to flooding land, but that has been categorically denied and dismissed by any scientific evidence that we've heard. Farming can continue on a lot of these lands. That the farming season perhaps will be shorter, but it isn't the case, and we should be absolutely clear that re-wetting of lands requires raising the water table, but doesn't amount to flooding lands and putting them out of agricultural production.
But if the farming season is shorter, then it would have an effect on the amount of animals that a farmer can carry on that farm.
Absolutely, but I think we need to be very clear that production can continue.
But production would be reduced?
Reduced, yeah.
Okay, so can I pass over to Geraldine now to talk about maybe the water and agriculture aspect of the Deputy's question?
Thank you. I'll just deal with the Cuilta first. I suppose that this all stems from a decision taken in 2014 with the equalisation of premium payments for farmers and non-farmers. So, look, once that decision was made, we've seen a huge increase in the number of plantations that are being established by non-farmers. So on average about 40%. In reality, it's probably more than that. So we have grave concerns, which we've raised directly with the department in relation to this, because we actually don't know the impact on the community. Any work that has looked at investor or non-farmer planting has looked at just the initial stages of planting, has looked at the jobs that are created when the forest is being established, but hasn't looked at the implications on that community because none of that premium enters the community. The income from the timber sales doesn't enter the community. So we'd like to see that study, particularly if it's a small, if the density of non-farmer planting within a community is small. Obviously, the impact is far less. If that density is increased, and there are concerns, but the reality here for communities, they don't know, and we don't know the impact. So we think, look, this whole non-farmer premium policy needs to be addressed. The reintroduction of the differential needs to be done, and we need to look. IFA have met with Cuilta on this, and we have said that this fund is in existence, but that there should be no future investment fund deals, and that they need to look at how alternative ways of reaching their target. So that's in relation to the question on the forestry. In relation to water quality, look, we are seeing that the measures that have been introduced on farms under consecutive nitrates action plans are beginning to take effect. We have to realise that when a measure is introduced, by the time it is demonstrated within the monitoring, there is a lag time, and it takes time for that measure to get through the system and to be reflected in the water quality. We're also realising that it's not just an issue of stock density, it's a complex issue, and there are a number of different factors, including topography, including the soil types, including climate and weather, that all impact on the water quality, in addition to stocking rate, but it is not the only factor. So look, we're seeing improvements, we're seeing additional measures being introduced, and look, we're hoping that and seeing that these measures will address water quality issues.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Roddy.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Chair. Just take the last point that was brought up there by Deputy Smith, and thanks for the questions. Just as regards Colcha and Gresham House, look, our position is quite clear. We believe in the new forestry programme that forestry support scheme, the grant aid scheme for forestation, should only be to those who have actively farmed the land for 5 years. And that would take out Gresham House. So obviously, what happened with Gresham House should not have happened. But it's a symptom of what had been happening, and I don't believe that we need to see that going forward. So I hope that answers the question for Deputy Smith. Just as regards the EPA report, and the water quality. Look, it is a big concern. There's no doubt about that. And I hear what members in the IFA have said, that there is changes to the nitrates derogation, and that is going to be reduced. It is reduced, and we hope that will definitely see an impact in water quality, because look, water quality affects everyone clearly, and we need to see that improvement. And definitely, if it doesn't, then we're going to have to go back and look at that again. I would say that. Just, I know Joe is going to come in on the biodiversity, if that's all right. But just one comment, Chair. Just and I know. You know, the science, I know we talk a lot about the science, but my understanding from the Commission as regards the nature restoration on re-wetting, and this is their text, they're saying that it is bringing the water back to a second, is a deliberate action that aims to bring the water table of a drained peatland back to that of peat-forming peatland. The peatland is re-wetted when the mean annual water table is near or at the soil surface. So that's how the EU are seeing that. Now, if we're seeing it differently here, then I hear what you're saying. I mean, maybe if we're going within a foot of the surface, then there could be a level of agricultural activity could continue. But that's going to be difficult to understand. I do think, though, when we look at Recital 55 in the Nature Restoration Regulation, they have clearly outlined 3 elements: Sagbar and moss. I'm pronouncing that wrong. They've talked about water buffalo. They talk about cranberry cultivation and blueberry cultivation. Now, interestingly enough, blueberry cultivation, I understand, does involve moulding. So I don't know how that's going to help in carbon, in sequestering carbon, but maybe it can be done other ways as well. But that's what they've outlined in Recital 55. That would be alien to all Irish farmers. Definitely. So look, I think I might let Joe just come in on just the comment around the biodiversity, and thanks.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat again, this is from the synthesis report for land use, which is under investigation today, and I'm being told it's peer reviewed. It says, while land cover categories most associated with high biodiversity values occur predominantly in the border west and Midwest regions. Now, I'm reading high biodiversity value as existing in those areas. And that's close to 40% of the agricultural area of the country. So something positive is happening in those areas where otherwise that mapping process couldn't exist, that evidence wouldn't exist. So I mean, that is, to me, that shows me that there is a high biodiversity value occurring in those areas. And where would you put a nature restoration law onto something that's described as high biodiversity value? So I'm going to rest my point there.
Thank you, Mr. Condon. And Dr. McGough, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Smith. Just to correct the record, Geraldine, you said we're seeing improvements in water quality. I'm afraid we're not. We are in some limited areas, but they're overshadowed by the declines. I think the last report said we had a 38% increase in nitrate river pollution and 24% of phosphate, so it's not a good story. And we haven't seen the measures beginning to take effect. In terms of hill farmers taking the brunt of the pain, and it's dairy farmers who are causing the problem, it is very true that nitrate is a significant issue in the south and southeast. But that's normally the story we talk about, because that's really the main kind of urgent pressure. But there is also problems in the west of Ireland at very dense soils where you have phosphorus and silt runoff. So although a lot of the problems are driven by dairy intensification, unfortunately we do also have problems on peaty soil, which can be drained. Peaty soil can be incredibly damaging in terms of runoff as well. So it is imperative that we get that addressed as well. And the nature restoration is quite broad. I mean, we're talking about re-wetting here today, but there would be other measures which I hope would take effect in areas like the south and southeast, like connecting rivers with their floodplains, which would, in theory, have potential implications for dairy farmers. In terms of the Gresham House deal, I don't remember what the Swan position was, but An Taisce was very much against it. Forestry needs a strategic plan. What we're seeing is forestry done in an ad hoc way. There's no overall plan for how we're going to get where we want to go and how we're going to protect the environment and how we're going to get social buy-in. So what the Gresham House deal did was kind of put that on steroids. So we're going to see all of the problems that we're seeing with the forestry system amplified. So we're very much against it, and Fintan may talk about this as he has his hand up, but we I think Stop Climate Chaos 1 and the Environmental Pillar, if I remember correctly, all called for Coilse's mandate to be changed so that they would prioritise biodiversity and climate issues. And until that happens, any massive ramp up in Coilse activities is incredibly worrying from an environmental perspective. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. And Ms O'Neill.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the point about the North West and the Midlands. So there's, I think, something being conflated here. Yes, there are more high nature value farms in the North West and Midlands and in the west of Ireland, absolutely. And these farms are more associated with suckler beef rather than dairying. And but the issue that we're talking about is re-wetting, and that's because of the carbon losses from farming from grasslands on organic soils. So it's important to point out that you could have high nature value farming, but you can also have carbon losses because of the grassland or the farming practice on that type of soil. So just because you have high nature value farming, unfortunately, doesn't rule out the possibility of other negative impacts that might need to be addressed, and that's the purpose of the nature restoration law. So it's wrong scientifically to conflate the two. We have to look at things in the round. Our organisations have been extremely vocal and critical of the intensification of dairy in the south and southeast and the water quality deterioration. So that, you know, we've been entirely consistent on that all along.
Thank you. And Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. If I could first just respond to Mr. Roddy's point where he quoted the nature restoration law. There's also a section in the preamble where it says, member states can choose from a wide range of restoration measures for drained peatlands and agricultural use, spanning from converting cropland to permanent grassland and extensification measures accompanied by reduced drainage to full re-wetting. So I suppose in an Irish context, there's an awful lot of farmers that are farming on permanent grassland, which is managed extensively. So in the context of the nature restoration law, there's actually a lot of farming that's ongoing that would actually meet the requirements of re-wetting. So it's not necessarily full re-wetting that's being applied. On Deputy Smith's point on Gresham, so I'm representing the Environmental Pillar here today, which is an umbrella organisation of 32 of Ireland's leading environmental NGOs. We don't actually have a position on many aspects of the Gresham House deal because my own personal view would be a lot of the public sentiment around it relates to the private nature of the investor, and that kind of falls outside the scope of our environmental remit. What I would say that we would have concern with is that we are supportive of Coilse lands being retained in public ownership. We are supportive of Coilse lands maintaining public access. And we are supportive of Coilse leading the transition to a more sustainable forestry model. So essentially a movement away from monocultures of Sitka spruce that are clear felled. What we're observing is that the Gresham House deal, Coilse are effectively the manager for Gresham, and that Gresham are getting the same deal that an Irish citizen would get in terms of their environmental requirements. So essentially Gresham House are funding more unsustainable forestry within Ireland. So from our perspective, that's not in line with what we would expect of Coilse in the state, and we wouldn't be supportive of more of that model of forestry. As Elaine also said, we wrote to relevant ministers saying that we want the legal mandate of Coilse to be reviewed along with Bord na Móna, and we referenced the Gresham House deal because the Gresham House deal basically exposed the lack of control that the government and the relevant minister, Minister McConalogue, actually has over Coilse's decision making. So the minister said in the Oireachtas that the model that Coilse had adopted was not the model that the government would have chosen. So, I mean, if that's not, I suppose, an alarming indication of the lack of control that the state has over public bodies, I don't know what is.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Kelly.